We had 25 people.
Yeah.
One of them is a friend of mine who serves in the German embassy in New Delhi, the capital of India.
Wow.
And he was a congregant of mine in the 3 years that I spent in Warsaw, Poland. At that time, he was working in the German embassy in Warsaw. So, but he is very talented with languages, and he learned Hebrew very quickly. So keeps reading my weekly sermon on the weekly portion, and he always reacts in Hebrew to whatever he reads. But we realize that not everyone is capable of learning new languages in a short while, and therefore what I'd really like to begin with is stressing that the Haggadah does not necessarily have to be in Hebrew, or actually the ritual component, like the blessings that we recite over the different symbolic foods, and the kiddush over the wine should be recited in Hebrew, but the essence of the evening, and that is telling the story of the Exodus, can actually be done in any language that that you and the people who are with you around the table this year or in other years, let's say normal years, understand, because that is actually why I wrote this thick book called Haggadah in History, because this book records dozens of different Haggadot from different countries all over the world, where the Haggadah is printed both in Hebrew and in the different languages of Jews in Arabic-speaking countries, in European countries, even in India, we're using for many centuries. Okay. I can see now Elisheva and Elizabeth, right? We have more people who
Brian is joining.
are about to join.
Brian has joined us.
Okay?
Yeah, you can start.
You could start. Okay. So
I'm going to put everybody except Rabbi Gil on mute. Anybody who would like to make a point, any point, you can press on the space bar or unmute and speak. Okay.
Okay.
good. I promise that I will limit myself to no more than half an hour in all
Right.
questions or comment or
Don't mute
just new
Rabbi.
ideas. Okay. Okay. Now I'm unmuted by the host, right? Or I'm the host. I can't hear you. Okay. So I guess I'm the host, so I can, if you just wish to.
You're the co-host. You can mute or unmute anybody you want.
Okay. I'm not only the co-host of this discussion, also a co-chair of the Israeli Vad Halacha, which is parallel to CJLS, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards in North America. And my co-chairperson is Rabbi Shlomo Zakharov from Jerusalem. And I'm sure you all by now know that, all of you know by now, that the main issue that we discussed, actually debated already 2 weeks ago, was the question of whether this year we should allow people to use Zoom or Skype or live stream or any of these modern technologies to conduct the Passover seder with family, relatives, and friends who are away, whether just a few blocks away or many, many miles away. And probably the surprising is that even before we published our different views about this issue, there were 3 Orthodox, leading Orthodox rabbis who published a responsum that they allow this year to use electricity to connect to Zoom or something similar, or before the beginning of the holiday. In other words, before we light the candles of Yom Tov on Wednesday at sunset, and conduct the entire Passover Seder through Zoom. But in our board of 7 rabbis, I was in the minority view. 4 of us said that we should not allow it, and that we should recommend that people conduct the main parts of the story of the Exodus, read and discuss it, and most of the Haggadah before sunset, already on Wednesday afternoon, and as soon as the holiday begins, turn off their computers or their smartphones. And even though I do not agree with their view, and I will myself conduct with my family and a few good friends the Seder through Zoom. I can understand it, even explain or try to explain why they think it should not be done. And the main reason of most of my colleagues does not have to do with the question of electricity on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, which in itself, as you probably know, there are different views between Ashkenazi rabbis and Sephardic and Adot Mizrach rabbis, since they didn't have electricity 3,000 or 2,000 years ago, and the whole question whether electricity is equal to fire or not is still debatable. But the main worry is what is called in the traditional or halachic literature ovdin dechol. In other words, something that is very typical to our routine actions or procedures during weekdays, during the work days, we should not do on Sabbath or a holiday. And we all must admit that during the weekdays, our fingers are busy for so many hours on the with clicking or punching on the keyboard of different smartphones and laptops and computers, and our eyes are stuck for so many hours during the weekdays on the screen of these modern technologies, that it is essential that on the Sabbath and the holiday we disconnect ourselves in order to really feel the change and view everyone around us and the whole, maybe the whole universe, in different eyes than the eyes and the fingers we use during the weekday routine. Um, and I have to admit that I already realized that even though I'll definitely turn on my laptop and put it on the seder table before sunset, before my wife lights the candles of Pesach, um, it will probably be impossible not to touch it throughout the evening. If several participants talk at the same times, and I wish, as the host, to mute them for, or some of them, in order to enable to listen to a question or to discuss the reply for this question um, during the middle of the seder. But on the other, these three Orthodox rabbis who published their responsum that allows the use of Zoom during the seder also give the reason, and I wish to explain or even expand upon what they explain. They explain that first of all, the main mitzvah of the Passover night is vehigadeta lebincha. You should tell your son, and of course, son may mean anyone who is in the younger generation, whether it's your biological son or your spiritual son, your disciple, whether a man or a woman, a grandson or a granddaughter, um, the story of the Exodus. And since this year we are locked at home, the only way to really carry out this commandment of vehigadeta, you should teach the story of the Exodus to the younger generation. The only way to carry it out is really use Zoom or Skype or any of these devices. And the other mitzvah, which is not unique only for Passover, but it's actually common for all the three festivals, Pesach, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, is the commandment, V'samachta b'chagecha, you should rejoice in your holiday. And we realize that a very important component of the rejoicing in a holiday is really communicating with other people, family, relatives, and friends. So if you do wish to ask me, I tell you in advance, yes, my reply is go ahead and connect to whoever is important for you to connect to during this Seder evening. Only make sure that you make this connection, and if you have any technical questions, I'm not the address. Don is an expert in all these modern devices, tell you how to create your own Zoom, and so you are not limited just to the first 40 minutes that it usually allows you. And if you have any question or comment about this issue, which I mentioned is probably the most controversial issue in the past 2 weeks, then please bring it up now. If not, I wish to suggest a few more ideas that are especially relevant this year, but maybe relevant on Passovers on all years. Anyone wants to comment on this? No? Okay. So I'm going ahead. I don't know, I mean, how you usually began, or what time you usually began the seder. With my family, it had to be really when it got dark, because about this time of sunset, I was still in a synagogue praying Ma'ariv, but which is actually the halacha, the Jewish law. Already, again, 2,000 years ago, they say one should wait until it gets dark. But I wish to say that if among your family, relatives, or good friends, there are children who are, let's say, preschool age, and you're worried that they may fall asleep in the earlier stage of the Pesach, then in such conditions, you may begin the seder already after sunset, right after sunset, even though it is not yet dark outside. The issue that apparently has been troubling Israeli families for many. The humorist Ephraim Kishon, I'm sure you heard his name, wrote about it already some 50 years ago. And that is the question, the problem that the text of our Haggadah, before we reach what is called Shulchan Orech, the actual eating of dinner, is so long that, and the people are get very hungry and because of this, get impatient during the reading of the Haggadah. So the popular solutions are to either to give someone, a grandpa or any other person who is very fluent in Hebrew, who zooms through the Haggadah to read it in speed, like some of our people pray the prayers in the synagogue to in such a speed that is hardly, you can hardly understand the words, and reach the Shulchan Orech and reach dinner as early as possible. The other solution that I heard from families, that they give some snack in the very beginning of the evening, so people are not hungry and they have more patience to listen. My family has had a different solution that I wish to share. I think we have had it since the Pesach seder on 1977, so for more than 40 years. We change the order of the order. You know that the meaning of the word seder is order. Um, and we actually, in a way, renovate or reconstruct the original order during Second Temple period and during the period of Mishnah and Talmud, in other words, of the first centuries, where people first um, had the dinner, and only after the dinner, um, the children asked the questions and the parents replied to these questions by telling the entire story of the Exodus. So what we actually do is, of course, recite the Kiddush over the wine, then eat these karpas, and then break the middle matzah and hide half of it for the afikoman. But then we wash our hands for the second time and bless over the matzah, eat the matzah, bless over the maror, eat the maror, whether you are using lettuce or horseradish for maror, all depending on your background. And then we eat the famous sandwich of Hillel, of 2 pieces of matzah, and then the maror and charoset in between. And moreover, we then dip hard-boiled eggs into salty water. And before we eat the hard-boiled eggs, we say Zecher lekorban chagiga, because the hard-boiled egg actually reminds us, or should symbolize, the first type of sacrifice or meat that our ancestors were eating, which was not the Pesach, this roasted lamb called Pesach, but rather a different kind of meat that could not necessarily have to be roasted, could be cooked or boiled or fried, as that was called the Chagiga, the festival main dish or main sacrifice beforehand. So, and only after we eat these, we then switch back the Haggadah to the 4 questions and continue with the rest. So we gain 2 things. On one hand, of course, people already had something in their stomachs and they are not hungry and they are not impatient. We can really read, explain, discuss the different sections from the Haggadah. And the other, or not less important, is the fact that the 4 questions that the children or younger people around the seder table ask are relevant, because nowadays the children recite questions. How come we eat unleavened bread? How come we eat bitter herbs and so on, without doing it? And then children don't remember it from a year ago. This way, they ask relevant questions since they already ate all these symbolic foods, and only later present the questions. Don, can you show on the screen the Hebrew the way we yeah. So I imagine that some of these terms sound familiar to you because they are in the first page of most of the Haggadahs, but I'll read them in Hebrew and remind you of their meaning in English. Kadesh urchatz, karpas yachatz. Kadesh, of course, the kiddush over the wine. Urchatz is the first time you wash hands without reciting and blessing in order to eat these green vegetables like celery and petroselia that serve as an appetizer. These green vegetables, usually dipped in salty water or in vinegar, and then yachatz, which means break into half of the middle matzah and hide half of it for the afikoman. And then right after it, we continue to motzi matzah. There are two blessings over eating the matzah, the hamotzi, which is the regular blessing over bread, and achilat matzah, the eating of matzah, the unique blessing only for the unique bread on the first night of Pesach. And then the next two things are korech and beitzah. Korech, you know, karich is the Hebrew word for a sandwich. The sandwich of Hillel with, of course, his sandwich was the piece of roasted meat between the two matzot, but we have maror and charoset instead between the two pieces of matzah. And then beitzah, hard-boiled egg, that I mentioned before. And only after this, Tza'ir Shoel, the young one, asks, by the way, it is very important for me to mention that both in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and 1,000 years later, Rambam, Maimonides, write that if there is no child or grandchild next to you, then your wife should ask the questions. Apparently assuming that in many families, the wife is younger than her husband. But if the wife does not ask the questions, then both the Talmud and Maimonides, Rambam say, then you should ask yourself questions. I mean, as long as there is dialogue and there is a process of presenting questions and replying to these questions that fulfills the main mitzvah, the main commandments of the first night of Pesach. So after the questions, Ta'ir Shoel, the next one is the Magid, which is the essence of the evening, telling the story of the Exodus and mentioning and also, of course, giving replies to the questions concerning what each of these unique foods symbolizes. And then Hallel, not the entire Hallel, just the first two psalms of the Hallel. And then we come to Shulchan Orech, the dinner. Tzafun Barech, after the dinner, eat what was hidden or concealed, that in Hebrew, Tzafun, actually the afikoman. So the last taste in our mouth is the matzah. Barech is the grace, the Birkat HaMazon. Hold on, I'll push it up. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Hallel Gomer, you conclude with the rest of the psalms of the Hallel. Tach Lam Vaser, open the door to the announcer, in other words, to the prophet who brings good tidings, Besorot, in Hebrew, actually to Elijah, of course. I'm sure you heard that they tell you this year, leave the cup for Elijah outside on the other side of the door and don't let him inside because you really don't know what he carries from other families that he visited. And then Chasal Sidur, you conclude the essential part of the Passover Seder, but there are still Shira Betzibur, the different hymns and poems. Okay, and I can see. I'll read. I'll read it quickly, but if you wish, I can. I can send it by email to each of you. אחרי השקיעה מקדשים על היין, כרפס מטבילין נוטלים הידיים, המוציא על אכילת לחם עוני, כורכים כהלל, שואלים על השוני, תיכות בגנות, מגידים הסיפור, מזמורי גאולה, שותים כוס שני, עורכים השולחן, הצפון נאכל, מברכים לאל זן. This is again with rhyme, so it's easy to remember. אחר כוס שלישי מוזגים למבשר, another nickname for Elijah is מבשר, על כוס רביעי הלל גומר. אוקיי. פריקת ארץ וגפן, חסל הסידור, מהדרין מוסיפים שירה בציבור. Which leads me to an important aspect that I say every year, but I wish to especially stress this year. The Haggadah is just like the prayer book, the Siddur is an eclectic book. In other words, it was gradually built up, constructed through many centuries of each generation, adding or changing texts of the previous centuries or generations. And within the Haggadah, there are, of course, some elements that you cannot do without, that you should not skip them, but there are even more elements that I would say are optional, that if they are relevant and if you feel you can explain them or expound upon them and make them relevant, go ahead and read them. But if they are not, you are allowed to skip them and or even replace them with some more modern passages that may seem really interesting and relevant for you and for the people who share the Seder with you. So definitely what the early rabbis in the first centuries agreed upon, that the story of the Exodus should begin with what they call gnut, condemnation, with something that is not pleasant to hear. And then as you proceed with the story of the Exodus and the 10 plagues, you conclude with praise and thanksgiving. In modern terms, you would say you conclude with happy end, but they don't call it happy end. They actually call it with praise. Of course, praising God for the deliverance from slavery. So as long as you keep this order, this sequence of passages, then your Seder is fine, even if you do not use some or most of the passages that you find in the printed Haggadah. Let me stop for a moment, and again, if you have either questions or comments, please feel free. Yes, Elisheva.
Hi. I think some people are going to be having Zoomed sedering. I don't know how many other people will be a seder of one. So I started to think about, how do you do a seder of one? And the first question I asked myself, and I made a decision, but I'd like to hear what your thinking is. I thought, I can just sit there and read the Haggadah. And then I thought, that isn't a seder. So my plan is to read it out loud. Nobody to hear me but my dog. But it made more sense. It felt more like it would be a seder to read it out loud. So that's kind of point number one. And if anybody else has any thoughts about that, I'd really like to hear. Is anybody else doing a seder of one?
I listened to Rabbi Dikla on Friday, and she had some suggestions for a seder of one. We have to go over her suggestions, and maybe we can send it because I think it's coming up out in Hebrew. And one of the suggestions was to try to be a guest, like you are, like dress up and behave to yourself, be a guest of yourself. And also ask,
I like that.
ask questions. While you read out loud, you can ask questions. You can ask the questions and answer them. So there is like a dialogue. She also suggested that you talk to other people that maybe are doing it alone, and you send to each other questions beforehand, and you print them, and then you open them, like you read them during the Seder. And also that helps you. You can see other people's questions, and then you can answer it. So you can, like, if you know of anyone who's doing it by themselves. And she was talking about that you are on your own, either you are on your own.
One person.
Yeah.
And I first wish to refer to the point that you brought up, and that is a question whether to read aloud. And the answer or the reply of our early rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud is definitely always prefer whatever text you read. Don't read it just with your eyes, but read it aloud, because when you read it aloud, you absorb it not only through your eyes, but also through your ears. In many parts of the Haggadah, there are puns or alliterations. I'm talking, of course, the Hebrew text that you grasp only when you read them aloud. By the way, there is a funny story in the Talmud about Bruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, who notices some of his disciples studying without opening their lips, in other words, without reading the text aloud, and she kind of rebukes them for doing so.
She's known for rebuking people.
And since we have for several texts on the melodies, so whenever you can chant or sing, it is even better chanting or singing. And I know it sounds very strange that you say to someone, well, ask yourself questions. I mean, what kind of questions I will ask myself if I don't know if I don't know the answer, I will not ask. And if I know the answer, what's the point of asking? It is not.
Well, I think in life we often ask ourselves questions because precisely we aren't sure of the answer, and it does make us think, which is part also of the reason that I decided that it made a lot more sense to read out loud.
Yeah. Okay. So I always recall one of the books that I remember children in the 60s or 70s used to read in the United States. It was called surprise in the barn where Farmer Hank wakes up very cranky, in a bad mood, and his wife tells him, now, Hank, eat your breakfast and tell yourself a joke, and you'll soon feel better. So sometimes telling yourself a joke or asking yourself a questions helps you to get out of the mood. And sometimes you ask questions, and it forces you to look up sources in different books or different commentaries, and you discover something new. I mean, even though I've been conducting Passover seders now for over 40 years, every year I find some new commentaries, some new explanations, or read the same text of Tractate Tzachim and discover that I actually did not fully comprehend it a year ago when I studied the same text. Okay? Any other comment or questions so far?
I have one other question.
Go
How
ahead.
does one deal with hiding the afikomen when you're going to be the one to look for it?
Okay. Let me put it this way. This whole idea of hiding the afikomen
Put on a blindfold. Put on a blindfold.
Right.
Before you.
And having the children look for it and then bargain what they get for it is a very late custom, and it is designed for a very practical purpose, and that is to keep the children awake and not to let them fall asleep during this long evening of the story of Exodus. But the original idea of the afikoman that is mentioned as already in the Mishnah and Talmud has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the idea that you keep a certain piece of matzah for the end of the meal, so you will not, while drinking one after other glass of wine, forget and eat the entire matzah, but that at least one piece will be the last thing you put in your mouth, even after you ate the dessert. Okay, so that was the idea of the afikoman. Of course, the very term of afikoman is a Greek concept, and it is the kind of sweet dessert that the Hellenistic or the Greek classical symposium people used to go out of home and get some sweets at their neighbors and get drunk, and this is what they tried to avoid, or actually forbid, and make sure you stay at home and finish the meal with a piece of matzah to remain in the last taste in your mouth.
So I can just put it aside and not have to go through the charade of hiding it.
Actually, exactly. And then you will be fulfilling what the original scholars or rabbis meant to begin with. I want to comment also about what is done. Oh, you want to?
I thought that you might give Maggie the afikoman and have a new game of chasing her around the house to catch it.
Yeah, like it would still be around to use as the dessert, as it were. Actually, she wouldn't touch matzah if it was the only food in the house.
Okay, I will gladly send all of you by email before the seder the list of things or passages that I believe you may.
There's Maggie. You can say hello.
Oh, hello. Okay. I'd like to know how she reacts to the story of Chad Gadya um, okay, where she supposedly plays a part.
The advantage to having Maggie at my Seder is that she doesn't mind how I sing. Everybody else does.
Okay, okay, fine. So the the thing that I want to mention is not or to emphasize is not only what you are allowed to skip, but also what I recommend to add to the Passover Seder. In each of the Seders in the past decade, we always put a glass of water in the center of the table, and I'm sure many of you are
Miriam's cup.
familiar with Miriam's cup.
I'm doing it for 15, 20 years.
I know, it began much earlier. It took time before me and my family added it to our procedure. This is really essential to mention the role of Miriam specifically, and then women in general. There are beautiful midrashim that claim that we were redeemed out of Egypt due to righteous women and the way that they struggled against the decrees of Pharaoh and insisted of becoming pregnant and bringing children to the world in spite of the what Pharaoh tried to limit the population growth of the Israelites. So by all means, this should be part of our seder, even though it is not mentioned in most of the printed Haggadot. But also, in maybe it will not be possible this year, but in future years, if around the table you have someone who experienced a personal exodus, whether from the former Soviet Union or from Ethiopia or from Iran, where it was really difficult to depart and get a license, a visa to leave the country and make aliyah, or even whether your exodus from the United States or the UK was with some difficulties or with some doubts and questions. This is important that you include it in your seder. Or as we say in the text, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot atzmo kihilu hu yatsa mitzrayim." Every person should consider himself or herself as he or she personally experienced the Exodus. And what can we say? Definitely in the past 70 years, we had so many amazing stories of Exodus. When my mother-in-law was still alive, we always asked her to tell the story how she boarded one of these ships, what's called Aliyah Bet, of the illegal immigration before the state of Israel, and how the British Navy dragged the ship into Haifa's port. But this year, I mean, through Zoom, we will have good friends in Kfar Vradim, north of Carmiel, where one of the participants will be a lady who is now 95 years old. She'll be 96, hopefully in July, and she's still bright and clear and will tell her story as a Holocaust survivor of making Aliyah to Israel. So definitely, this is something worth adding to your Passover Seder. Yes, Elisheva.
A number of years ago, quite a number of years ago, a friend of ours had a huge Seder, and about 10 or so of his guests were Sephardi. And their tradition was to go around the table and each person said, I come from wherever they came from, and I'm going to Jerusalem. And each one would then say just a few words, not lengthy, about what that journey meant to them. And I always thought that that was a really powerful way to talk about making an exodus, to look forward to one. Of course, we were in the United States at the time. But I thought that was very, very powerful. And it's the only time I ever ran into a situation where people had that custom. But it was a wonderful one. It'd be nice to adopt.
I'll remember, and that was years ago, a very similar custom also of people from whose families were from Sephardic origin or Middle Eastern countries, where at the very beginning of the Seder, I think it was right after Halach Ma'anya, one of the adults, so let's say the elderly people, went out of the home, came in carrying a bag of apparently matzot on his shoulder, and all the children came up to him and asked, where are you coming from? I'm coming from Egypt. Where are you going to Eretz Israel? What are you carrying? Unleavened bread and so on. In other words, there was a whole play and interaction of that the children could take part and really act out, so to speak.
That's also a nice one. These were people's real lives. You know, I come from New York, or I come from Pennsylvania, or wherever. In their real lives, planning future, really to come to Israel, to Jerusalem. Not all of us made Aliyah, but some of us did.
Okay, okay. Yeah, they say that.
But it is very
what's his name? Rabbi Nachman from Bratslav. I'm sure you heard about this famous rabbi. Used to say, wherever I'm going, I'm on my way to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. He apparently did try to make Aliyah, but failed, and on halfway had to return to the Ukraine. And as you know, he's buried temporarily in the city of Uman in the Ukraine, but his followers or disciples say that he wrote in his will, move my gravesite when the Messiah comes to Jerusalem. If you allow me, I wish to now return to the days ahead of us, today, tomorrow, Monday, and the following Tuesday. I'm sure some of you will use the fact that you have nowhere to go and that you're supposed to stay home all the time to clean thoroughly and get rid of not only the chametz, but every dirty corner. And rabbis for decades have been telling you, listen, dust is not considered chametz, and you are not ordered or not expected to clean away all the dust from your bookshelves or from your bedrooms and so on. But we cannot fight tradition that has survived our grandmothers and great-grandmothers for several generations, and people make a thorough, cleanup of the whole house or the whole apartment. So fine, go ahead, do it, but don't delay things to to Wednesday, in other words, this year to the eve of Pesach, you should attempt to finish not only getting rid of chametz, but cleaning the house by Wednesday, let's say at 9 o'clock or 9:30, and to the best of your ability, after a light lunch, take a nap, as long a nap as you can. Don't set on any alarm clock. So by the time you reach the beginning of the seder night, you will not be exhausted by the work you invested cleaning the house. Okay, so
I ask
that,
Mechirat chametz, sale of chametz, is the Tnuah doing that, what they usually do with virtual Mechira? What are we doing this year?
yeah, yeah, I'm sure you or some of you remember that in previous years I tried to arrange two things. I first encouraged people, and many of you did, to bring all the leftover chametz, all the food that you have, which is not kosher for Passover, to Kehilat HaKerem, and then I gave it to a Bedouin woman who promised me to use it, giving it to needy families in her village, not far away from Carmiel.
Do you know which village it was?
Hmm?
Do you know which Bedouin village it was?
Um, the name of the woman is Hamda, and she's actually the woman that works at Marion Juster's home. She's the cleaning lady for Marion. And I forgot the name of the village. Hold on. Ziva? No, Ziva doesn't remember either. But I can ask Marion. I'm sure she knows.
Yeah, I'll see her tomorrow on Zoom. We're having coffee together. I'll ask her because I have friends in Khawalid.
Friends where?
In Khawalid, which is
okay.
a Bedouin village just east of Haifa.
That's a long way away.
Okay, okay. I mean, this is what I call in Hebrew limsor bimkom limkor, to hand over instead of selling. In other words, to hand over the chametzik food, including pasta and macaroni and so on, to families of non-Jews. And I'm not very excited about this fictitious sale, because they know and we know that the sale is not a real one, and that as soon as Passover is over, I mean all 7 days of Passover, they cancel the act of selling, and the chametz stays in our homes. So I can understand that is when if you hold a grocery store and you cannot give up, but if you have food chametz at home, in most cases by the eve of Pesach, you can finish eating most of it and get rid and not suffer a big deficit or loss of money for the chametz that you got rid of.
We do a pretty good job of burning the chametz in the morning. Around 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, we burn all the chametz. It's usually have quite a bit left over. So, you know.
Okay. So
cereals and.
So I'm sure you have received notices by email from the Masoti movement that they organize we say, a sale of chametz for everyone in the Masuti movement. You send either fax or email or any other of these modern devices permission to a rabbi named Alan Michel, a French-born rabbi who lives in Jerusalem, to sell all our chametz to a non-Jew who lives in Jerusalem, which is, I mean, something that we are not excited about, but we realize that this is what Jews have been doing now for many centuries. By the way, during Talmudic times, when they speak, in the first 2 centuries, when they speak about selling the chametz to a non-Jew, they actually speak about a real sale, not a fictitious one. In other words, they actually took out all chametz food out of the house and actually sold it to non-Jewish neighbors because they, just like us, lived during the first centuries of the Common Era in the vicinity of many non-Jewish people.
I have another question for you about the synagogue.
About
The synagogue, Kiryat Kerem, we have chametz in the building. We're not cleaning it out. What happens with that food at the end of Pesach when we go back?
Yeah, it's very problematic because the halakha, Jewish law, says that if you owned a chametz during the 7 days of Pesach, you are not allowed to use it even after Pesach. It's called chametz she'avar alav haPesach. So, in other words, if you think that hopefully after Pesach will also be after the corona disease, and we will be able to return to our regular sessions and prayers and services in the building of Kilat Kerem, we will have to get rid of whatever food was left there now.
For instance, I bought a lot of nasherai for the Beit Midrash. It's sitting in a cabinet there. It's all that's unused. We'll have to give it away or
sell it.
So you can sell it. You can just send
Personal household?
even an email message to Rabbi Andy Sachs in Jerusalem, and that you to ask him to sell whatever chametz is left as a board member of a Kerem congregation. You have the right to sell it on behalf of all of us, and he will make sure that it is sold to a non-Jew, to some non-Jew in Jerusalem.
In actuality, we'll have to sell it or throw it away at the end, right? When we go back. You know, the actual material.
To buy it back, yeah. There is a simple procedure also about buying back the chametz as soon as the Pesach is over.
We still can't use it. We still can't use it though, right? You said at the beginning
if you didn't own it over Pesach,
if you didn't own it during the 7 days of Pesach, then and you just buy it back after Pesach is over, then you are free to use it.
Okay, so I have to write to Andy Sachs and ask him to buy it, and then we'll buy it back.
Yeah, and in order to save you the headache, he will probably ask you or send you a form asking where in the building you have chametz. So since you are not sure where in the building, you can say all over, in all different corners of Hakerem congregation.
And in the kitchen, that's all. Yeah.
Are there any additional ideas or questions?
I would like to add that we'll make sure to have some kind of translation to English of what we heard on Friday morning, suggestions of Rabbi Dikla. They might be very beneficial to everyone in any form that you make the seder, but especially for people who are doing it on their own. So we'll make a summary of it in English and send it maybe to Julie so she can, or whoever sends out for the whole Kehillah.
Yeah.
I want to add an English translation to the fourth question that we have been asking in recent years, because the fourth printed question is whether sitting or reclining. And actually, in modern times, we don't follow this classic custom of eating while reclining or lying down on
Which was Greek or Roman in origin.
I'm sorry.
For rich people to recline while eating is Greek and Roman. It was never
Correct.
really ours.
Definitely. It was the Greek and Roman custom to have your main meal while lying down on sofas, leaning on your left elbow or hand, and then eating with your right hand. Rather, instead of it, we say in Hebrew, שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים נחפזים או נינוחים. On all other nights, we eat whether in a hurry or relaxed. Because sometimes we do eat dinner in a hurry. We want to get out of home to a theater or to a movie, or we are in a hurry to watch some TV program. But this tonight, kulanu ninochim, we are all relaxed. In other words, we under no time pressure this evening. And I think that this version of the fourth question makes much more sense and is much more relevant to our reality than the printed fourth question. Okay?
Can you add that in Hebrew to what you send us?
Yes, I will send it by email, and also to Dawn if you wish to include it in the WhatsApp correspondence. Okay. So again, I wish you all a very significant and joyous Pesach seder this year, and hopefully next year we can have it in the traditional, normal way of face-to-face.
We can say לשנה הבאה ביחד.
Yeah.
Not בירושלים, but ביחד.
כן. Thank you.
Very much. להתראות.
להתראות.